Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside Today's Boardrooms, your source for everything you need to stay on top of corporate governance, presented by Diligent Institute. I'm Lisa Edwards, Executive Chair of Diligent Institute, and your host for today's show. Today, I'm joined by Stephen Brown, who serves as Senior Advisor at KPMG's Board Leadership Center. Stephen, thank you for joining us.
Very happy to be with you, Lisa.
So let's get right into it. Recently, a survey of directors by the Wall Street Journal and the NACD found that although the vast majority of directors, nearly 83%, believe that it's critical for directors to understand ESG, many of those same directors lack the confidence in their board's ability to oversee the issues. We've seen similar findings in our own research at Diligent Institute. So I understand that you think a part of the problem might be how the term ESG is understood by the board and management. Specifically, you've talked about clarity on boards and how management discusses ESG and some of the significant problems that originate from a lack of clarity starting at the top. So first question, tell us a little bit more about that tension.
Sure. Absolutely. First of all, I should say I'm very thankful to be with you today. And the study you mentioned, of which you guys have done studies on this, is that there's so much to this phrase called ESG. So there's a lot going on. I do think, as I've looked back in the last 3 years, talking with boards, then seeing how this has progressed, there's a clarity issue. And with clarity, starting from the top, it's hard to communicate and make strategic decisions if everyone is not on the same page. So historically, this phrase ESG, environmental, social, and governance, it was known by a small group of folks who were in the governance space, investors in the stewardship space. But then in the last few years, it grew to the public understands it now. So much so, whether it's investors, Congress folks in stake houses, the public at large. And it moved from being a process, describing a process, to a product. And we all know there are a lot of products out there with the label of ESG. We know the EU, we know the US, SEC is trying to look at it. How are we going to label mutual funds that call themselves ESG? There's a lot going on out there. And I think part of the confidence of boards for doing this oversight is that they've been deluged with a lot of stuff. There's a lot out there. They're learning. They're trying to figure out legislation that's out there. But I think it's time to take a deep breath. And as we looked at sort of the issues of what happens when you don't have really clarity of your own definition of ESG, bad things happen.
Yeah, I think the term is very confusing for people in some cases. Like somebody might be using that term to talk about DEI&I, somebody else may be using it to talk about climate, somebody else may be using it to talk about recycling. So it does get a little confusing. Can you give some examples of some of the things that you're talking about?
Talking about a process, then becoming a product. And unfortunately, sort of where it is today, it's sort of a Rorschach test, an ESG Rorschach test. You say it, and people, when I say people, I'm talking about board members all the way through the person on the line, because this will have to, when it's executed at a company, it's not the board members, it's folks all the way down the line. But it's become a Rorschach test for a lot, whether it's political biases or personal biases, and it shouldn't be that way. So I've seen a boardroom where we're sitting in the boardroom and there are 9 board members, and there are 3 different definitions I can see that the board members think they're talking about. Corporate philanthropy, that you gave the example of how they're thinking it's one thing or the other, or they're thinking about it as an investor would think about it. So it's so dispersed and it's used as this overall term, which is not good. I've seen a board really struggle and make a strategic decision about what they were going to do on a human capital management issue. They said, we're going to go do this. So it's extra than what the law requires. And management is assigned, some senior members assigned to do it. They're going out and doing it. And then have another senior member said, we're doing that. I don't believe that. We shouldn't be doing it. And the person says, wait a minute. The board, everyone signed off. And this is not like you can, if you're going to say no, you might have to leave the firm. I'm gonna go talk to them. And it's one of the only places in corporate America where you do have these emotive situations where folks say, I think that's wrong. I think we should do X. So it's interesting. And what we've seen is that then the message is not getting through. And there's things that we think, one, inside the boardroom, that boards must do to clearly define what they're talking about. So all the 9 board members or the 12 board members, whoever it might be, is on the same definition about what they're talking about before you even sort of get to management, and then management takes it down the road there. So we've seen a number of times where it's just not clear. And they'll have an hour conversation about this, but it's still not clear exactly what they mean by that.
Maybe talk a little bit about what are you seeing as the root cause of that sort of why does this problem exist?
Indeed. One, it's a term that does have a lot of emotions in it. It can be, and it started that way. Two, it's new, and particularly when we talk about a boardroom, average age 63, very senior people, accomplished folks who've done many things, and then you're telling them today they're 65 years old that they don't understand something. Right. And there's a little bit of a pushback. And by the way, because you have so many definitions, you're not sure what management is giving you. And if you sit on multiple boards, maybe the way management uses that term is very different from the board that you're sitting on. So there's mass confusion there. The other thing is that because it's not a set upon definition. So when we talk about EBITDA, for instance, everyone knows what we're talking about using that piece of jargon. And jargon is supposed to help us in business. It's a shortcut to communicating. But here, it can get a little muddy here. So that's part of it. And of course, because it means different things to different people, it sort of does matter who is saying that term. And so much like a Rorschach test, if someone says it and you believe that they're really right-leaning, then you're going to have that sort of view to it. If you believe they're really left-leaning, the organization, what have you, they're going to have that view towards that. And you don't get to the crux of the issue here. So there's so much going on. And I should say this is really a disruption, a disruptive and a transformation standpoint. Healthcare saw this too. So if you talk to doctors, when platforms came in where doctors were going to put in information, not simply written into a chart, but put into a computer and sent somewhere where other doctors and other places are going to read what they say about their diagnosis, doctors had to be careful about the terms that they use. And it wasn't simply terms which the residents on their rounds understood what Dr. Brown was saying, because that's the way he writes. This was going to be read by someone perhaps 3 states away trying to make a same decision on the same person. So they had to change the way and standardize how they talk when they were putting, or how they write when they put information about a patient in the system. Sort of similar here. We need to be very precise about the language that we use.
So maybe that's the start of your answer to my final question. But I guess, based on all of those things, what would your advice be to boards and senior leaders who are having trouble in these areas? And what are some of the solutions that they can bring to bear? Is it coming up with a common definition and measuring it, or how do you think about guidance for boards as you talk to board leaders?
Exactly what you said, Lisa, and we can end it right there, but I'll go a little bit further, which is, let's take a deep breath. I think all boards need to take a deep breath and understand this is a transformational time. So after that deep breath is decide and acknowledge that we have to be clear and that we have a clarity issue. And you'd be surprised at a lot of folks not wanting to acknowledge that, because seems very simple. And of course, management knows what we mean. But when I feed back different scenarios of talking to management, talking to the board and management, and then having my colleagues who are doing work in that space for the company and hearing stories, for instance, a property and casualty organization where someone trying to look at climate change says, no, we don't really use that term. That term is a very nasty term. And our state that sort of doesn't like that term. And we don't really have exposure, when they're a property casualty insurance company. And so it's like you're not getting it, but that is the strategy of the firm from an insurance standpoint, looking at how they're going to do underwriting, so they don't get it. So number one is really to acknowledge that there could be a problem. So let's test that out. Second is focusing, forget what's going out there in the market. Focus on, what does ESG mean to us? And really define it so that you're all on the same plane. And then that's how you can communicate it. And when you have that firm definition of the things that are really material to your strategy, run with it and really work on making sure everyone down the line understands that. For instance, in the DEI space, there are folks who haven't been comfortable with that, with what's encompassed in DEI, and we know what's inside of it can vary. You need to be very clear about that, particularly since we had a Supreme Court decision dealing something on education, and there are folks who are trying to extrapolate that and extrapolate. I'm a lawyer, it's like, you're extrapolating the wrong way to sort of see if this works. Folks need help in really defining how the company views a particular issue. So acknowledge that there might be a clarity issue. Focus on the definition inside your company. Forget what the market is saying. Focus on what it says inside the company. Have a definition that you believe makes sense and you endorse. Then check downstream that folks are really adopting it. And last is really have precision in language when you talk about it. Don't try to bundle ESG. Break it down. Really break it down for people, because then you can really have a conversation. You don't want to create a Rorschach test, and no one does that intentionally. But when you just use that term and there's nothing really defining it, you're leaving it up to the listener, who's your employee, to determine what that means for them.
I love that. So you heard it here first, folks. Acknowledge it, focus, make sure it's relevant for your organization, and measure it, and beware unintended consequences. So that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us and sharing that wisdom and advice with our listeners. Of course, if you would like more information about KPMG's board leadership, go ahead and Google that. They have a ton of information there. And we will be back next week with another installment of Inside Today's Boardrooms.